Hello, and thanks for joining us for the France 24 interview. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Last weekend, Pope Francis paid a 2-day visit to Ireland, making him the first pontiff to visit the predominantly Catholic country in 39 years. But the welcome he received was a far cry from that of Pope John Paul II back in 1979, and the crowds were a fraction of the size, an indication of the waning influence of the Church in Ireland, and also a sign of the Irish people's collective sense of horror and disgust at widespread sexual and physical abuse carried out at Catholic churches, schools and workhouses, abuses which began to come to light in the 1990s. Well, during his visit, Pope Francis met with some of the victims. He issued a sweeping apology for what he called the crimes of the Catholic Church in Ireland. Well, my guest today is Colm O'Gorman, a victim of clerical sexual abuse and also an author and activist. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Colm. Now, you organised a 5,000-strong gathering in Dublin called Stand for Truth, which was timed to coincide with the papal mass at Phoenix Park on Sunday. What was the message that you and those who joined you at Sunday's gathering wanted to send the Pope and the Vatican as a whole?
Thanks, Tom. It's never good to start with looking to inflate numbers, but actually I think we had multiples of that number at the event. The event wasn't so much a protest. As a matter of fact, it wasn't a protest at all. Rather, it was an affirmation, a statement of what Ireland now stands for, of a very different Ireland from that in 1979 when Pope John Paul II came here. In the weeks leading up to the visit, I and others had been calling on the Pope to tell the simple truth, something I've been asking popes to do since 1998 when I first sued John Paul II to get him to reveal what he knew about the rape and abuse of children in this country. All the way through his visit, Pope Francis steadfastly refused to do so. I know you mentioned a papal apology for abuse. There was no such thing. There was a begging for forgiveness for the crimes of priests. There was references to cover up on the part of some bishops. There was even some oblique references to accountability. But there was no simple, frank, honest acknowledgement of the proven fact that the Vatican has directed a cover-up of the crimes of the clergy underpinned by its laws and its norms across the Catholic world, the rape and abuse of children, of women and of vulnerable adults, in a determined effort, a willful policy, seeking to protect the institution, its power and its money. So Francis didn't do that, and we asked him to do it. But Sunday was about us talking about what we know, because in Ireland, we've now spent decades investigating these horrors. We spent €82 million in 11 years determining the truth of what had happened in industrial schools, reformatories, orphanages, institutions run by the Roman Catholic Church, where appalling violations of the human rights of children and women were perpetrated. So we know what we know, and we were coming together to assert ownership of that history and reflect on the fact that this is a changed Ireland and that we will continue to work together to move through and beyond all of that, not in a way that denies it, but in a way that acknowledges it, that learns from it and that continues to learn from it, in marked contrast to the failure of this Pope, the previous Pope and indeed of the Vatican, whether it's here in Ireland or anywhere else in the world.
OK, so there was an apology and you're saying it wasn't explicit enough and it lacked accountability. What specifically, if you could have added to what the Pope said, what specifically would you have added? What words would you have put into his mouth?
Well, first of all, I would have set aside everything that he said because, again, you know, semantics I know, but I don't accept that there was an apology. There was a begging for forgiveness. I think the word apology appeared perhaps in one of the comments that he made, but it wasn't clear what he was apologising for. Pope Francis just needs to make a statement something like this, that as Pope, head of the Roman Catholic Church and head of state of the Vatican City-State, he acknowledges that the Church has, across the Catholic world, implemented a deliberate, willful policy of the cover-up of the crimes of its priests and its clergy, that is, the rape and abuse of women, of children, of vulnerable adults, that cover-up was required and underpinned by its laws and its norms, and it was designed to protect the institution, its position, its authority, its clergy and its wealth. And then if he wishes to apologise for that, which I would imagine he would want to, then indeed that starts to mean something. But critically, until we have an acknowledgement of that fact, how do we even begin to understand what an apology means? Or even more importantly, the actions that need to flow from that to address it, to provide real accountability, to ensure that there's meaningful change.
Do you get the impression we've heard the last on this issue from this particular Pope, or do you get the impression we're going to keep hearing more from him, and that he is going to keep his eye very much on what happened in Ireland and perhaps come up with something new. Do you hold out any hope for that?
Well, a month ago, the Vatican were making it clear that they didn't intend on addressing this issue in Ireland at all. We were being told that this wasn't a papal visit, a state visit, or even a pastoral visit. It was the Pope coming to a conference that was happening here in Ireland, and therefore that there probably wouldn't even be time to address the abuse issue. So the Vatican wanted, and have wanted for years, to move this completely to one side to make it history. That's simply not possible. There has not been accountability, there has not been an honest telling of truth, and we can't be at all confident that there's meaningful change. So it won't go away. Now, today the Pope has made yet another statement. Again, he's talking about the failings of ecclesiastical authorities. In this latest statement, which just emerged this afternoon, he's saying that they did not know how to respond. And I'm sorry, but that's a deceit. They did know how to respond. They responded in the way that they were directed by the Vatican, by cardinals and by popes, to cover up these crimes. That wasn't an accident. It wasn't on the basis of any ignorance. It was a deliberate, willful policy that was implemented. So, you know, until a Pope learns to tell the truth, until the Pope is prepared to demonstrate that he understands that accountability means not accountability for others, but accountability for the institutions of the Vatican, then I think these demands will continue.
Given what happened to you, and given what happened to many others in Ireland at the hands of people in various Catholic-run institutions across the country, would you have simply rather that the Pope hadn't come at all?
No, not at all. I mean, I absolutely understand that the Pope is the spiritual leader of, 1.6 billion Catholics or something of that order. The majority of people in this country still identify as Roman Catholic. They have absolutely a right, and it needs not just to be respected, but even celebrated, that people want an opportunity to joyously manifest their faith. I have no issue with that. However, if the Pope is going to come to Ireland, it should also be acknowledged that he's the head of state, of a state, directly implicated in some of the gravest human rights violations in the history of this republic, and of a state that sought by design to cover up those crimes. As we discovered just weeks before his visit, in 2003, the Vatican Secretary of State had a conversation with the then President of Ireland on a state visit to the Vatican, in which he sought to see whether Ireland would enter into a concordat, a legal agreement that would allow the Church to bury evidence of these crimes and make sure they were not available for any kind of state investigation. That's a direct cover-up. So we have both a spiritual leader and a head of state with real responsibility for some very grave crimes that needs to be accountable. The two things are not entirely separate, but one does not cancel out the other. The faith is not responsible for the crimes of the institution is. The faith doesn't need to account for the failings and crimes of cardinals, bishops and popes. They do. The institution needs to do. And that's what accountability looks like.
OK, let's just talk for a moment about the personality of Pope Francis, because he gives this impression of wanting to build a much more sort of inclusive church, and that's angered conservatives in the ranks of the Vatican. In fact, he's under fire quite seriously from conservative branches of the Vatican. They think he's far too liberal. But do you get the impression that he himself has demonstrated more willingness to unearth the truth than either of his two predecessors?
I think on this issue, there were a lot of good words and things that suggested good intentions at the beginning of his papacy. And I have to say, I admire and respect many of the things that Pope Francis says on other issues, on refugees, on migration, on poverty, on social exclusion. Those are good and positive things that one would expect, frankly, a Pope to say. But on this issue, I think actually his actions speak an awful lot more than his words. This is a Pope who appointed Cardinal Pell from Sydney to one of the most powerful positions in the Vatican, despite the fact that there had been for many decades very real and ongoing concerns about his responsibility for cover-ups in that archdiocese. And now, of course, he's back in Sydney facing criminal charges in relation to his own sexual conduct. This is a Pope who went to Chile last year and had to know the scale of what had happened there and the scale of the cover-up. The Vatican had investigated some of the cases relevant to the controversies that arose when he was there in 2011. And yet when he went there and was challenged by victims about the cover-ups, he accused them of slander. He attacked the victims. This is straight out of the Vatican playbook of old. This is a Pope who came to Ireland and professed that he knew nothing and hadn't heard about Magdalene laundries and mother and baby homes. despite the fact that in 2014 he had a one-on-one audience with Philomena Lee, a woman who made a film about her own experience of exactly those institutions. Never mind the fact that Ireland has been investigating these issues for 20 years and seeking to engage with the Vatican on them. So that statement that he didn't know demonstrates either an extraordinary level of incompetence on the part of the Pope and senior officials within the Vatican, or a simple deceit. Neither of those are particularly encouraging.
OK, we're running very short of time, but I'm just wondering whether your own experience when you first came forward was one where people didn't believe you and this mighty institution probably tried to frighten you into not coming forward. It must have been terrifying, wasn't it, back then?
It was fairly difficult, all right. I mean, I went to the police in 1995. I went public at the end of a criminal trial process in 1999. I started a civil action to sue the Pope and the diocese in 1998. I have to say that the response from my society was mixed. There were people who were very supportive, and there were people, and actually I understand why, who found this very difficult to believe. This threatened their understanding of themselves, of their position in the world, and indeed of their faith. So it was fairly terrifying for them. In terms of the Vatican, no, has never been particularly positive. I've been told I should hang my head in shame. I've been told that films that I've made to try to explore this were fit only for the bin. I've been described as somebody who's not fit to speak in church or at church. No, I mean, the Vatican have never been particularly welcoming, I have to say. But at the level of the everyday, the support from people, including many people of very deep faith, including people in religious life, has been enormously supportive and continues to be, I'm happy to say.
And just very briefly, would you still consider yourself to be a Catholic, Colm?
No, I wouldn't. I don't hold any religious faith, but I have enormous respect for people who do. And actually, more importantly, I have enormous respect for the foundational values that are meant to underpin that faith. So values like truth, like justice, like love, those are the values that motivated everything that we did in here in Dublin last week.
OK, well, I'm afraid that we're out of time. Thank you so much. Colm O'Gorman, a victim of clerical sexual abuse, an author and an activist. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to France 24. And thank you to you for watching. Stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Natalie Savarikas, and you'll usually find me in news, reporting on Greece's enduring financial turmoil and protests, but also the refugee emergency, here on France 24.
Natalie Savarikas, one of the 160 France 24 correspondents around the world.